Petworking is presented by Maya Strategy Group, a leading market research and strategy consulting firm, helping clients in the pet care and animal health industries navigate strategic challenges for almost 2 decades. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Petworking. I'm Peter Kensath, Vice President of Maya Strategy Group, and I'm here today with one of my oldest friends and my college roommate, Henry Whitehead of Canin LLP. I brought Henry in today because I had a very interesting conversation with Paul Diaz, founder and CEO of Offer First, about the veterinary non-compete. And those of you who have followed the show know that we have done a lot focusing on the challenges facing the veterinary profession in today's day and age. We are facing a veterinary shortage. Mars Petcare notes that there's a projected shortage of 41,000 veterinarians by 2030. We are seeing veterinarians stop practicing, leave the profession because of compassion fatigue and veterinary burnout. We are looking at a profession that has one of the highest suicide rates. It's an uncomfortable topic, but I think we all need to acknowledge it. I think veterinarians trail only police officers, firefighters, and military in terms of the suicide rate. And we're seeing studies from Royal Canin that note that 70% of veterinarians have had a colleague or peer die by suicide. And in the face of all of this, there is a underlying problem that limits veterinary mobility within the field of a veterinary non-compete that is included in many contracts that veterinarians sign. And Paul, when I was talking to Paul, Paul noted that the majority of veterinarians are not aware that they are signing these non-competes. And then that limits their ability to move between practices, to relocate their families, and further contributes to this shortage of veterinarians that is not only a compounding issue for the mental health and welfare of the veterinary profession, but is also affecting ability for pet parents to provide quality care to their animals because of lack of access to veterinary care. So I brought Henry in as our legal expert. Henry and I went to college together at Dartmouth. He was my roommate senior year, a fraternity brother of mine, and is now at Canin LLP. And Henry, and as I said, Paul, founder and CEO of Offer First, looking to get awareness out and encourage discussion around the veterinary non-compete and hopefully find ways to get more flexibility in employment arrangements for veterinarians in today's day and age. So Paul, Henry, thank you so much and welcome to Petworking.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, thank you so much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be reconnecting and to talk about all this.
Yeah, I'm excited. This is going to be fun. I guess maybe a good place to start. Paul, trying to talk about the impetus, about your background and what led you to start Offer First, and talk about the successes and challenges that you've experienced since starting the company.
Well, I've been in the recruiting space, Peter, for over 20 years. I've led recruiting teams in multiple industries for over 20 years. My last corporate position, I was the vice president of DVM recruiting for one of the nation's largest veterinary employers. And I spent my entire corporate career in California, where non-competes were non-existent. It wasn't something that was ever on my radar. And as the vice president of recruiting, my job wasn't to talk to the actual candidates. I didn't have conversations with the job seekers, so any stories about the impact of the non-compete just never floated to my desk. So I left that position and started a consulting company, basically an agency recruiting company. And with that company, my intent was to test the Offer First process. That's how Offer First came about. But I was also now responsible for talking to veterinarians on a daily basis. And that's when I started learning and identifying this trend about the issues of non-competes. And then, I think it was late 2020 when this one veterinarian reached out to me, and, she had an incredibly horrible experience with her first employer, very toxic work environment. And she told me that she had thoughts of suicide, primarily because she just couldn't bear the thought of not being able to practice medicine, right? She wasn't able to relocate. That just wasn't an option for her. This hospital, that work environment was something she just didn't enjoy going into day to day. And that's when I realized that nobody else was talking about it, so I had to. And I started my campaign against non-competes and announced that my company would no longer support any employer that required non-competes. That was a difficult decision. It cost me over 90% of my clients and revenue. But I'll tell you, Peter, it was the best night of sleep I ever had. And here we are today. I think more veterinarians and veterinary professionals are talking about non-competes today than ever before. And I'm incredibly happy about that.
Yeah, it's an incredibly relevant topic in today's day and age, and I want to bring Henry in to kind of give us the background on non-competes and their legal standing. I think you made a great point, Paul. You know, in certain states like California have abolished the non-compete. I do a lot of work in the tech space as well as in pet care, and I know for the majority of my clients that are in California, non-competes are not something that they worry about. Uh, it, but it is something that is still decided on a state by state basis. And so the choice of venue, as Henry is going to get to, it can be very important in determining the enforceability of a non-compete. And, you know, we are looking at right now, I think the FTC is considering voting on a rule. It could come as soon as next April that would abolish non-competes across all industries. But while we are, you know, still under the purview of non-competes and veterinarians are dealing with them, you know, Henry, can you kind of give us the rundown of, you know, what these veterinarians are facing? What is the enforceability? What is their means of recourse? And, you know, is there a way to, you know, either exclude these from employment contracts or, you know, is this pretty standard, you know, and give us your legal perspective here.
Well, thank you for a very targeted, narrow question, Peter. That's no, there's obviously a lot to unpack there. First, to give both you and Paul a little bit of background, just so you understand where I'm coming from. After our time at Dartmouth, I got a law degree at UCLA. I have been a business litigator primarily for almost 15 years now, and done really a huge wide variety of work. Only a part of that has been employment litigation. But in the employment space, I've represented both employers and employees. So I like to think that I can see both sides when we're talking about these kinds of issues. And then also to just reiterate that I've spent 90% of my career out here in California, where, like you guys said, by and large, non-competes are unenforceable, for lack of a better word. I don't want to say unlawful, not necessarily. That said, there are, even under California law, certain narrow exceptions. So, for example, when a partnership is dissolving and the partners agree not to compete with each other, when somebody is selling their business, including all the goodwill, and basically saying, you know, here, you can take over my practice and I'm, you know, retiring or dropping out. So even in those contexts, non-competes still do have some life to them in California. I won't speculate about the FTC or other laws that may be coming down the pipe or anything like that, but I can say that right now, non-competes and their enforceability is really a function of state law and driven primarily by state law. There are certain states like California and a handful of others where non-competes are almost categorically unenforceable. There are other states, New York is one, where non-competes are limited either geographically or in terms of their time and scope, or only in terms of being necessary to protect an employer's trade secrets or other confidential information. So, and then we can talk about, you know, the circumstances under which the parties might agree in an employment agreement that it's governed by a certain state's law and whether that would apply, and if so, what the differences are. So when we're talking about non-competes right now, there's just a huge variety of law out there. And the big answer to almost any question is it depends.
Right. And I think, you know, that kind of raises the issue, right? Is that, you know, we look at, you know, you described the situation, you know, that led you to found Offer First, Paul, and you know, and to decide that you weren't going to deal with with companies that were going to enforce non-competes. And certainly, I don't think anybody looks at this to say, oh, I'm the non-compete because I want to, force somebody to remain in a toxic work environment. I want a non-compete because, I want to limit somebody's career mobility, right? So Henry, one of the things, as you mentioned, looking at it from the side of the employer, I'd love to, talk a little bit about what are some of the, justifiable reasons that an employer might want a non-compete. And then on the other side of it, because I'm sure we could play devil's advocate and argue, well, these veterinarians aren't aware that they're signing non-competes, read the employment contract, right? But at the same time, if it's standard and an employer isn't going to agree to strike that from your employment contract, what are the options for recourse? Because and what are the the enforce what are some of the things that you can contest in terms of enforceability? But maybe start from the perspective of why, as an employer, do I want a non-compete? And in situations where they're not serving their intended purpose and are actually detrimental to the emotional health and well-being of the people who are subjected to them, what are the options? Are there options for recourse?
Well, no, I appreciate that, and it's a very important question, and I certainly don't mean to turn this discussion into me advocating for or against non-competes or in any certain situation. I do think that a couple of things are at play. First, I think both you and Paul have used the word control. And as a recruiter, Paul knows how much effort employers oftentimes have to put into finding good, qualified people who can do the job and do it consistently. And once you have those people, you don't want to let them go. And to the extent that non-compete provisions can act at the very least as a further incentive to keep employees in their roles, I would think that that would be a reason why employers would want them in their contracts. Another thing to keep in mind here is that often there's almost always an imbalance in negotiating power when we're talking about an employment contract, right? Very rarely is an employer and a potential employee going to review a contract and cross out certain points or try and negotiate certain points. And that's probably the case even if they are represented by counsel. Just because the employer is the big, stronger entity in that kind of a negotiation. And that's especially true in industries where there are big corporate powerhouses that are kind of running the show, which I understand that lots of industries, but I also understand that the veterinarian community, there are a lot of big businesses now in a way that there probably weren't 30 or 40 years ago. All of those HR and corporate departments see the other contracts that the other big companies are putting out and mimic those and think, why not us too? So I do think that to an extent with non-competes, as well as with other types of contractual provisions, there's probably a level of herd mentality or groupthink involved here. Again, and I say this not as a lawyer, I say this just as, from kind of a business sense.
Yeah, I mean, as a business strategy consultant, I can say, pretty categorically, I would think that most organizations that are participating in the veterinary non-compete are doing it because there is a shortage of veterinarians and they are competing for talent and trying to restrict the veterinarians that they have brought into their organization from going and working for their competition. It's competition for a limited resource. That being said, I think when we look at the unintended consequences, like Paul describes, if you find that an organization isn't a good fit for you, if you find that the culture wasn't what you expected, if you are in a toxic work environment, it can feel pretty hopeless. I would imagine that look, these are the skills I have. I'm a veterinarian. I can't, for whatever reason, I don't want to relocate my family X many miles. And I think we should definitely get into the geographic radius of enforceability. But the when we look at that, it's like do we really want to be propagating a system that keeps people in a job where they're unhappy, right? And I think when we look at why they're considering abolishing non-competes, one of the principal reasons is because it prevents workers from switching jobs. It deprives workers from competing for higher wages, because if I can switch, it's been proven time and time again that laddering and switching organizations is one of the most effective ways that you can earn yourself a raise and better working conditions. And from a business perspective, while yes, the non-compete allows companies to, prevent, to more effectively compete for limited resources, it also limits the talent pool that is out there, right? So there is a double-edged sword for businesses here, right? By engaging in the non-compete, you are restricting yourselves to the resources that you have, and it's making it more difficult for you to go out and recruit from other organizations. Paul, I'd love to hear, in your experience, how many veterinarians, since that initial case, have you talked to that have been negatively impacted by non-competes?
In the last, well, I'm going on 3 years now, so God, I would estimate close to 100 easily. And that's just the ones that have reached out to me with situations like toxic work environments or their inability to relocate. Doctors who are having difficulty being a doctor because of the non-compete. But doctors who come to me to have me review their contracts, and doctors who have helped avoid the non-compete are significantly more than that. But here's the thing, guys. This philosophy of, hey, the employer doesn't want them to go, right? That they don't want to let their employees go. That's not the employer's decision. If it were, we'd be talking about indentured servitude. You do not retain employees with contractual clauses, you retain them with your culture. And if you have to rely on a contract to retain employees, that's a number one indicator that you don't have a good culture, as far as I'm concerned. Now, the other thing is that it's less about competition, right? We're focusing this, it seems like we're focusing a lot on the competitive nature of this environment and the shortage of veterinarians and how competing for that talent is so difficult. But the non-compete in this industry really isn't about that. It's about money. The non-compete in the veterinary industry is about revenue. The employer that holds the most non-competes controls a larger portion of the industry's revenue. Because with a non-compete, what I am telling these doctors is, hey, you know what? If you ever decide to stop making money for me, I'm going to make it as hard as possible for you to make money for anybody around me. And that is all this is about. It's about money. And everybody knows that the last 10 years, the veterinary industry has seen an influx of PE and venture capital money like never before. It has turned from this compassion-based industry to nothing more than another one of revenue-centric, profit-focused industries. And the only thing that investors are concerned about is the return. And that I can confidently say. They don't care about the care of your animals. They don't care about the doctor's mental health. All they care about is their return. And that's what this non-compete is about. And that's why I'm starting to see, I've got a contract right here on my desk, just sent to me today, right? This is a contract from one of the major corporate employers sent to me today from a new grad who's not even a doctor yet, doesn't get licensed until next summer. And they're asking her to sign a contract for a 2-year non-compete. Now, 1 year has been the standard for general practice veterinarians. That's what I've seen for the last 2 years. And now I'm starting to see them increase it to 2 because they want to control that revenue.
Yeah. And I think that, it's just another, angle through which to look at it, that like we were talking about earlier, Paul. It comes down to trying to protect their business interests. But I think you raise a great point, and it's something that I very much believe as a partner in my company. One of the things I try to focus on, and my partners and I try to focus on, is we provide a solid culture. We try to uphold a culture that serves as a retention tool. Certainly, um, the non-compete, it's a very much a double-edged sword, and I do think you raise a good point. I mean, I don't think anybody can fault investors for wanting to get a good return on their money. That being said, that attitude does fundamentally clash with the reason that most veterinarians get into practice. I don't think most veterinarians go to veterinary school to try to make copious amounts of money. I'm sure they end up doing all right for themselves, but a big driver of the mental health crisis is that lots of veterinarians graduate hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. It takes them years to pay off that debt. And if they're not able to freely move between organizations, like I said, that further limits and restricts their earning potential. And for a lot of them, another big driver of compassion fatigue is, these people became veterinarians because of a love for and a desire to help animals. And when everything is predicated on a bottom line decision, that can be problematic. Henry, I'll raise some good points, around the duration of a non-compete, saying, 1 year is the standard, but now he's seeing more too. I've seen industries where contracts contain a 3-year non-compete. I know it's on a state-by-state basis, but in your experience, what are the limits around geographic enforceability? I was having drinks with a veterinarian, from the Vermont area here the other night, and he mentioned that his non-compete was 5 miles, but 5 aerial miles. So you kind of, you flew it around on the map, and he was like, when you actually do 5 aerial miles from the clinic I'm practicing at now, it means I would have to leave this, the Chittenden County area to practice. That seems to me like 5 aerial miles seems reasonable, but I'd be curious, Paul, what are some of the larger geographic radiuses you've seen? And Henry, I'd love to hear you talk about what are we looking at in terms of enforceability when it comes to these provisions.
Well, let me start really quickly just to say that, that this is a big question mark. And it's something where, whenever I'm advising clients on any lawsuit, I can always say, here's what I think, and here's your strengths and weaknesses and stuff like that. But I can never tell you how a case is going to come out because I'm not the judge, or if it ever got there, a jury. Another thing to keep in mind here is I would imagine most of these employment agreements, even in California, most of the employment agreements have arbitration provisions, meaning that any of these disputes are going to be heard by private arbitrators, and employers put those provisions in generally because they think that arbitration favors them and that the arbitrators tend to be more employment friendly than a judge or jury might be. I don't know if that's necessarily true in practice, but it's another sort of layer to keep in mind here as we talk about these contractual provisions. So I don't mean to punt on your question, but the short answer is I also am coming from a place of, I don't want to say ignorance here, but it's not been a regular part of my practice practicing in California because it doesn't come up here all that often. And then to talk about something like a geographic radius, I imagine that you would have to think about that. Different states, different regions might yield different results there. A 5-mile radius in Chittenden County might seem completely unreasonable, but in other parts of the country, that might be reasonable. I don't know.
So, Peter, one thing I just want to kind of go back to your comment about, hey, it's okay for investors to expect a return. And I absolutely agree. Couldn't agree more with that. But here's my problem. When that return is expected, or when we expect that return at the detriment of those who are responsible for generating that return, that's when I have a problem. Okay. So I'm okay with investors getting a return. That's the nature of the business. But again, when we do it at the detriment of those that generate that revenue for us, there's a conflict there, right? And let's look at the companies like Small Door, Veg, one of the best veterinary emergency groups in the country, Rare Breed, Modern Animal. All these groups have investors, but none of them require non-competes, and they successfully operate throughout the country. So this argument that I hear a lot where, hey, I need this to protect my business, is completely false, because there are many, many companies operating without it that are operating very well. And here's the other kicker. Most of these companies that require non-competes also operate in states like California, where they successfully have operating hospitals. So why is it not needed to protect their business there if they're operating so successfully? Just there's this hypocrisy that exists that nobody ever talks about. And the CEOs of these companies, they won't talk about it. And that's another one of my problems, where if you're an executive leader at one of these companies and you can't answer basic questions about why you require a non-compete, why you enforce non-competes, or you ignore any discussion whatsoever about these policies that you require and enforce, that is the number one indicator of a problem. And they know it, and that's why they avoid it. Now, this air mile topic, yeah, every single one of these contracts are air miles. And although 5 may not seem significant, because the contract on my desk right now is for 5 air miles. And that's what the new grad told me. She said, hey, it's not that big of a deal. It's only 5 miles. Well, then I explained, I showed her the difference between 5 miles and 5 air miles. All right, there's a little difference there. She's still like, not a big deal. And then my next screen showed her how many opportunities were in that 5 air mile radius that she can no longer accept. And it was over 30 hospitals, I believe. 30 hospitals within 5 air miles. This was a major metropolitan area that she's looking for a job in. All right. So there's 30 promotional opportunities, 30 developmental opportunities, 30 pay increase opportunities that she'll never be able to take if she signs that contract. So, this 5 mile thing, people like to say, oh, it's not a big deal, but it is. And at the end of the day, why does my current employer get to dictate my future? They shouldn't. And the best thing, we talk about protecting businesses. There is no legal tool out there. There is nothing out there that will protect your business better than happy, well-paid, challenged employees. And that's the truth.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point, Paul. Where I'm interested, because you see, you raise the question of developmental and promotional opportunities, right? And from the veterinarians I know and I've talked to, a lot of them mention that they will switch hospitals. We have a new veterinarian at my dog's veterinary practice, and I was chatting with her after we had our first visit with her the other day, and she had mentioned that she had gone down to Hanover, where we're from, the Upper Valley area, Henry, Dartmouth. She had gone down there and worked for a while in a different practice. Now that is probably like 70 some odd miles from here in Chittenden County, and for some people, maybe that's not a big deal. But moving from the northern half of a small state like Vermont to the southern border of New Hampshire, it could be a big deal for some people. If you have family, if you have kids here. But she did mention that she got better. She got to learn from other veterinarians. She got to pick up on new tools and techniques. She did some emergency shifts. That's one thing I'm curious about, because I've heard conflicting stories here, Paul, and I don't know, in your experience, are the non-competes specific to general practice versus specialty and emergency? Are they two different non-competes? Or if I'm practicing in an emergency hospital in an area, would I be prohibited from going and working at a general practice?
It all depends. I mean, the non-compete's a non-compete across the board. The bottom line is, for example, again, I'll bring this contract up. This is for a general practice veterinarian. but this non-compete prevents her from not just working within that radius of this hospital, but any hospital this corporation owns. And they own over, what, 600 hospitals, okay? Not just that, she cannot provide any type of veterinary service. So if she wanted to do shelter medicine on her spare time, she wanted to volunteer, wouldn't be able to do it. She cannot practice in any capacity. Now, the specialty doctors, I feel incredibly bad for them, because those are some of the most aggressive non-competes I've ever seen. I've seen them covering 30 plus miles. I've seen them covering entire counties. I've seen them covering entire states. All right. And those are generally no less than 2 years, if not more. And the same thing for emergency veterinarians. So it just depends on how egregious the company wants to be. I've seen the gamut of all of
them. And it's interesting when you say that, because, we talk about the shortage and the projected shortage of 41,000 veterinarians that we're expected to see by 2030. But I think even, personally and across the board, we're seeing it already. We've seen it, as a result of COVID. You had 23 million animals adopted during COVID. Huge population spike. You had, clinics that weren't allowing walk-in patients. You had, masking requirements and then in response to that, you saw a lot of veterinarians being like older veterinarians, boomers, deciding, okay, this is a good time for me to cash out. This is a good time for me to sell to private equity. This is a good time for me to retire. And it was and is very difficult for a lot of people to find veterinary care. I know during the pandemic, we had an issue where Peony needed an emergency visit, and it happened while my vet was open. They were closing in 10 minutes, but I called. They're like, oh yeah, we wouldn't be able to get you in, and for till next week. You should go to the emergency hospital. It took thankfully it wasn't life or death, but like it took almost 24 hours for us to be seen at the emergency hospital. They sent us home and said, we'll call you. And when you hear about provisions, you can't provide any veterinary services. Like if you wanted to pick up shifts at an emergency hospital because there's a shortage of veterinarians in your area, like, to me that goes fundamentally against the ethos of the profession, which is to provide care and help to animals. And I know we were discussing, non-competes don't, the AMA, I think you said, Paul, deemed them on non-competes for human practitioners of human medicine, medical doctors. They deemed non-competes unethical for them in 2016. And, other than being able to, like we talked about, make sure that you have access to the greatest number of veterinarians in a time where there is a shortage for them, where there is a shortage of them, I don't see the non-compete really benefiting an organization otherwise, because there's not really trade secrets that are being protected from a veterinary medicine perspective, because if you're advancing new therapies that can provide better care for animals, theoretically, you should want that knowledge to be spread. It shouldn't be a trade secret that you know how to repair a dog's ACL better than another hospital down the road. It shouldn't be a trade secret that you've developed an innovative procedure for fixing a twisted stomach. That kind of runs counter to the whole ethos of providing medical care, whether it's for humans or animals. And so I guess my question, Henry, talk to us a little bit about, protecting trade secrets under a non-compete, if that would be, permissible from a medical perspective. And are there other vehicles that corporations could use, obviously, to protect themselves and their business interests while serving the interests of providing better care for animals and better working conditions for the veterinarians that are providing that care?
Sure. Again, a lot to unpack in your questions, Peter, as always. I guess what I would start by saying is that your question brings up, I think both we need to cabin what we're talking about when we're talking about non-compete agreements and what they are and what they are not, and the other sort of legal issues and legal doctrines that come into play here. It's not just contract and employment law. It's also, for example, trade secret law. So, an employer is allowed to maintain trade secrets and prevent others from misappropriating those. So the classic example is the recipe for Coke or something like that, that's kept under lock and key, and only a handful of employees know it, and is really their secret sauce to what they do. We also need to talk about things like copyright and trademark law. If you have brands or logos or a business, obviously an employee who leaves can't take that with them and use that to start their own business and confuse customers. We need to also talk about other forms of contractual clauses like non-solicitation agreements, which would prevent former employees from soliciting clients, even if they're in a business or industry or geographic region. It's in some respects a double-edged sword, because if, folks like Paul who think that non-competes are terrible and that we should just get rid of them, have their way and they're gone, on the one hand, for employers, there are still all of these other things that they can do to protect their business, and that could also be used as a cudgel against former employees if they really want to be litigious, and if there's really grounds to be. On the other hand, if you get rid of non-compete, suddenly all these other things, I think, become that much more important to employers. And I'm just not necessarily convinced that getting rid of non-competes would, lead to this sort of bright, shiny new day for employees. I think there's still a lot of ways that employers could have some control over what happens when employees leave, and would still have lots of different viable claims against employees. Does that answer your question?
Oh, do you want to? Do you want to chime in?
But none of those
He's chopping at the bit.
But none of those claims would be a result of me just wanting to get a new job. And that's what this is about at the end of the day. I support trademarks, copyrights, patents, NDAs, non-solicitations. I support all the other tools that the government provides to employers to protect their trade secrets. But the thing about the recipe for Coke, it doesn't have to go through peer review. And that's just the thing. That's why you don't see this issue of trade secrets in the healthcare environment, right? But, at the end of the day, and it's not just me that wants to see these non-competes go, it's the Federal Trade Commission as well. It's a pretty big organization, so I'm glad to have their support. But Henry, you know what? There's something I've got a non-compete in front of me from Blue Pearl, all right? One of the Mars companies. And I feel like if I didn't read it word for word, you guys wouldn't believe me. But this was in a contract from one of the veterinarians.
Are you allowed to screen share?
Yeah, I'll screen share. So this way, I'm not making it up. Share screen. Here we go. Can you see this?
Yes.
All right. So this is from Blue Pearl. This is a 2-year non-compete, 15-mile radius of any current or future location. So hospitals, they don't even own yet. They are preventing you from working around. I mean, come on, it gets to the point of just ridiculousness. Oh, and this is another good one. In addition, while employed by the hospital and as part of the duty of loyalty to hospital owed as an employee. I mean, give me a break. This is the type of stuff they're putting in these contracts for these veterinarians. So not only can you not work within 15 miles of the hospital that I employed you in, but you can't work within 15 miles of any hospital I may own in the future. I mean, this is just ludicrous to me.
It is interesting, though, Paul, just reading that other highlighted section that you had at the bottom, that they do provide a means for this individual to work as a relief veterinarian. So they aren't completely preventing them from engaging.
No. And this, yes, you can work as a relief as long as it doesn't exceed 10 consecutive weeks or 10 days within consecutive weeks. So yes, they'll let you work as a relief veterinarian, but they're going to control the amount of time you can do that as a relief veterinarian, right? Now, the thing about this whole situation is, imagine this industry, Peter, right? We know about the shortage. We know how long you just explained how long you had to wait to be seen. Imagine an industry where this non-compete didn't exist. And I, as a veterinarian, I'm working in hospital A, and I like it there. Great environment, everything's awesome. We're well staffed, and I need some extra hours. I'm trying to save up money for a pool or whatever it is. And my current employer just can't accommodate that. But there's hospital B across the street where people like you are waiting weeks to be seen. And hey, you know what? I can go over there and just do a couple shifts and help those patients out, right? And I can do that freely. Imagine across the country, veterinarians could just do that freely. But the reason why most of these employers that require non-competes don't want that to occur is because they're afraid hospital B is going to treat that person better than they can. And now all of a sudden that person wants to go and work at hospital B. But again, if you have a positive culture, that's not something you worry about. That's why Veg doesn't worry about that. Small Door doesn't worry about that, right? Because they're so confident in their culture that they know that their employees are going to come back.
I guess the question I would have, Paul, when I'm reading that, you know, the clause about like capping the amount of relief hours, and I think you raise a good point on one side of the spectrum, but playing devil's advocate here, could that clause be interpreted to be understood that, look, I don't want, you burning yourself to the ground, right? Like if you're doing 40 to 50 hours a week at my clinic, I don't want you taking on relief shifts that are now pushing you up to 70, 80 hours a week. And maybe you're not as sharp in your ability to provide medical care as you would be if you were working a balanced shift. I understand, it's difficult. We don't, we live in a free market economy, free society, right? But like, I don't know, you hear stories about, residents in human medicine pulling these shifts where they're getting like 3 hours of sleep. And I look at it, I'm like, if I'm going under the knife, I don't want somebody who's on 3 hours of sleep operating on me. If my dog going under the knife, I want somebody who's alert, attuned, and I don't want to prevent their ability to make money. If you need to take on extra shifts, great. I know that, that's a reality for a lot of people with being in debt, but they're also, I don't know, if you're looking at protecting like the reputation of your brand and your, whether you're Ethos or Blue Pearl or Banfield or VCA or Small Door or Veg, right? Like, are there any provisions there that they have that, try, to ensure that the continuity and quality of care that they're purporting to provide as an organization?
So I get that. And yeah, I could buy that argument, but I'm on the side of these are some of the most highly educated individuals walking this earth. Okay. These people are smart. They're not going to put their license at risk. They're not going to put their patients at risk. And if they do, playing devil's advocate, if that were to happen, there's an entire other mechanism to address that, and it's called the disciplinary process. It's not a contractual process.
Right. And obviously, sadly, any claims for malfeasance or malpractice against a veterinarian, I think from what I have read, there are almost non-existent, and ability to recoup damages, even in the horribly tragic event that, malpractice, cost you the life of your pet. I don't think we've seen any substantive jury awards against veterinarians, for that. So I don't necessarily, huh?
I'm sorry, but part of that is because animals are treated as property in the eyes of the law.
Right. There are pet insurance is underwritten as P&C insurance. Yes, absolutely. And we don't, we value animals as family, but from a jury verdict, we are not valuing the life of animal the way that we would value the life of a human being. Yeah. We could debate the philosophical merits of that, in a whole podcast episode. But I guess my point in bringing that up is that I don't necessarily, it's not as though a corporation is protecting against a large verdict against it if they were to have somebody who was practicing, while sleep deprived, and it was found that they weren't providing an adequate standard of care. That doesn't seem to be something that they should be concerned about from perspective. I think it's more about, if you're going to look at that lens, it's more about reputational integrity and knowing that when I go to one of these clinics, I'm going to get this quality of care. And
there are so many things that employers with good leadership can do to also prevent those burnout type situations, right? That's employee engagement. That's understanding what's going on in the lives of your team. That's understanding what their needs are, what they're trying to get out of from that professional relationship, right? What's going on in their personal lives that may be impacting that professional relationship. That's the type of interaction that good quality companies focus time on, right? That's the real difficult work. That's the work that companies with positive cultures don't ignore, right? And that's how you avoid these situations. But yeah, you know what? You could go ahead and throw it in a contract, and then you could discipline the employee for working 11 days instead of 10 days at relief without ever understanding why. But like, all I'm saying is that this industry, the backbone of the veterinary industry, was based on compassion. Human beings who dedicated their lives to the care of animals, right? And I feel like we've just moved away from that. It's moved so far away from it. And we've taken this industry away from the people who it belongs to, the veterinarians, the veterinary technicians, the practice managers, everybody who has their boots on the ground in the hospitals, treating these animals and consoling, right? And counseling the pet parents like me and you, right? Those are the people that this industry belongs to, but it's just taken this major shift away from them. And folks, I know that, I've gotten feedback that my tactics are aggressive and all kinds of other like negative comments. And, generally it's few and far between. The positive comments are significantly outweigh them, but I share a commonality with these folks. Everybody asks, why is this my fight? I'm not a veterinarian, right? But I share a commonality with them, right? That unfortunately high suicide rate. And I've lost many of my friends to suicide. And when these veterinarians tell me these stories about their mental health and how this is impacting them, that's what compels me to act so passionately, and some people misinterpret it as aggression. And I get it, and that's fine. But it's not. It's just absolute passion towards helping these veterinarians understand something that traditionally has been ignored in this industry. They don't get it in schools. When I go to talk to these veterinarians at their schools, 100% of the times, Peter, and I'm not exaggerating this, 100% of the times after I'm done, I will have students come up to me and tell me that nobody has ever said what I told them. And that is another unfortunate aspect of this industry. We are not preparing them well enough. So here's the thing, at the end of the day, my efforts may not change anybody's mind. None of these corporations are going to end their non-competes because Paul Diaz is out there talking about it. But what will change this culture is if I can empower and educate enough veterinarians to simply stop signing them. These investor-backed groups, these employers that depend on veterinarians to keep their lights on, if they had to choose between keeping a non-compete in their contract and being able to hire veterinarians, in the blink of an eye, that non-compete would be gone. So as soon as I'm able to influence enough veterinarians to simply say, we're not going to sign them, this thing will be nothing but a bad memory, and we won't have to rely on the FTC.
Right. And there is the potential that the FTC, will abolish them come April. It'll be really interesting to see what comes of that. Henry, I guess in your perspective, what I think one of the things is Paul raises a good point. We expect a lot of our veterinarians, and there are a lot of things that can, the non-compete is I'm very happy we've had this conversation. We've brought light to this important issue, but there's a lot of other things that we've talked about on this show and other things that we haven't fully gotten to discuss on this show that are contributing to the mental health crisis in the veterinary profession. The non-compete is one of them. The rising costs of veterinary care and increasing cases of economic or financial euthanasia. We just did an episode that touched on that subject where, you know, we have very low adoption of pet insurance. Veterinary bills are, you know, have increased at least 50% in the last 7 years. When we adopted Peony, it cost $65 for a vet visit. It is now over $90 a visit at the same practice 7 years later. And there is no, unlike in the human healthcare system, there is no negotiated regulated rate because we're still in the early days of the Wild West. So a lot of parents, if you don't have pet insurance, you can be looking at staggering medical bills that you can't afford to pay. But getting back to what we're discussing about today, and absent all the other issues that contribute to compassion fatigue and burnout, we're not trained. Vets are not just expected to practice medicine. They're expected to, if they're going to hang their own shingle, they have to become business people and practice managers, and they have to deal with hiring. We certainly, as Paul said, doesn't seem like we are training them on, being advocates for their legal standing if most of them aren't aware that these non-competes are in their contracts. From a legal perspective, Henry, what do you find is, a good negotiating tool to get a non-compete removed or to have the provisions of the non-compete limited? What are some options that vets have available?
Well, no, I absolutely appreciate the advice that Paul says that he's offering to these veterinarians to, review these contracts carefully, to negotiate these provisions, to refuse to sign them if that's really their position. I mean, the only other thing I'd add on top of that is hire a lawyer. I have worked with all sorts of professionals, and I would say white collar. I mean, I don't know whether veterinarians consider themselves a white collar profession or not, highly educated professionals who have a value in their career, who could be impacted by different contractual provisions, be that non-competes, non-solicits, all of the other things we've discussed. And have folks review employment agreements before they're signed and get the rundown of what's in there from an attorney if they don't feel comfortable doing that themselves. One of the points that you made just now, Peter, that really resonated with me is the extent to which veterinarians have to not only be good doctors to animals, but also, be business people and lawyers and HR departments and everything else that goes into running a practice. It's certainly true with lawyers as well. I work for a small law firm, and the folks who run it have to not only be very good lawyers, and they are, but also have to be good business people and good HR people and everything else. And it's not easy, which is why you rely on professionals. So when we're talking about negotiating contracts, it's oftentimes an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, I think is the old phrase. Hiring a lawyer on a front end to review a contract so you know what you're getting into could be a big difference maker for a lot of people. After the fact, there's very rarely any leverage to renegotiate the provisions of an agreement or something like that. And, the other thing that I say is that one of the big risks that employees leaving could face is not necessarily whether this non-compete provision will be upheld or not, or limited in some way or not, or anything, but just the risk of being sued. Because if you are sued by an aggressive employer who decides to pursue this matter, whether it's an arbitration of the courts, hiring an attorney like me on the back end to represent you in a lawsuit can cost you tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the nature of the dispute and how it unfolds. So it, oftentimes makes a lot more sense to hire a lawyer, pardon me, for a lot less money on the front end, negotiate a contract that you're comfortable with, rather than running that risk of being sued and, having to shell out for attorney's fees and face an uncertain result.
Absolutely.
You hit exactly what I wanted. I don't really even need to ask my follow-up question, but I was going to say, I think in a lot of cases, we can debate the merits of whether a non-compete is enforceable or unenforceable, or whether it is too broad in geographic scope or in length of time. But the reality of it is at the end of the day, like you said, if you find yourself up against a corporation that wants to enforce a non-compete against you, it's going to cost you a fair amount of money to defend yourself from it. And so, I think, what you just talked about, the advice that Paul is offering and the advice that Henry just offered, for the vets out there, far better to carefully review your employment contract before signing it and make sure that you are comfortable with the provisions of what you are signing. It's shocking to me to hear, Paul, that, this, to me, I think that's one of the biggest takeaways that, hopefully people will get this episode is it may sound simple, but review your employment contract before you sign it. And if you're not, sure of what it means, bring in professional help, get an attorney. It's astounding to me that people are finding out about this after the fact when it is negatively impacting their life and they're up against a rock and a hard place.
Henry, I think you'll appreciate this because one of the pieces of advice that I give to veterinarians who are often told by colleagues, hey, just go ahead and sign it because it's not enforceable. Don't worry about it. It's not enforceable. I hear that a lot. And what I advise them or what I tell them is, look, there's only one person that can determine the enforceability of this, and that's a judge. And that judge is very expensive to get in front of.
It absolutely is the case. And, one of the hardest parts about being an attorney in all sorts of disputes, not just employment disputes, is I can tell my clients what I think about their case. I can review the agreements. I can tell them what the strengths and weaknesses are, but I can't guarantee results. In many respects, it's just like medicine in that respect, and it's a practice. And there, it's an unfortunate fact of life, but you can't make those guarantees unless you're the decision maker.
Absolutely.
It's true. It's true. It definitely, it is something that, I think it's good that we discuss these issues and that's a big part of the reason why I have this show, why I founded this podcast is, certainly we're not going to resolve whether non-competes should or shouldn't exist in the veterinary profession today. I think we've outlined a lot of the reasons that they can be harmful to the veterinary profession and a lot of alternative enforcement mechanisms that companies could turn to. That being said, like you said, Henry, there's, you take away non-competes, smart legal minds are going to find ways to enforce what the advantages on the playing field that they want to enforce. But that being said, as and I don't want to say commoditized resource, but as an in-demand resource, veterinarians are uniquely empowered right now to take charge of their negotiations and in their employment opportunities. We're in a situation where there aren't enough veterinary schools to graduate the number of veterinarians that we are going to need in 7 years. Again, that deficit of 41,000 veterinarians. I don't think anybody's really fully contemplated what that could look like. If we thought the lack of access to veterinary care during COVID, which is starting to get better, but is still somewhat tight, was bad, I don't want to know what it's going to look like in 2030 if we are actually short 41,000 veterinarians that we need in this country.
If I could offer one last thought on that, Peter, and I say this as a philosopher, not a lawyer, not anything else, and I'd be interested in Paul's take on this because he's offered a number of interesting policy and philosophy-based arguments for why these non-competes should not be here. From a business sense, there's a huge shortage of veterinarians. Non-competes, in some respect, one thing we haven't talked about is veterinary salaries. I imagine that if the costs of veterinary services are going up, there's room for companies to pay veterinarians more. And if you can pay your employees more, they're certainly a lot less likely to leave. By contrast, if you have your employees under non-compete provisions, you probably don't feel that incentive to pay them more to distinguish yourself from your competitors. And if huge swaths of this industry are under non-competes, then does that existence of non-competes not depress salaries or keep them artificially lower and contribute to the, missing tens of thousands of veterinarians that you've highlighted? I don't know if there's an answer to that. It's a theory, and I don't know if it even could be proven if you tried to test it, but it's just been floating around in my head while we've been having this discussion.
Henry, I'm sitting here thinking, why didn't I think of that sooner? You're absolutely right, because and it can be proven easily. I mean, in just my anecdotal evidence, the non-compete employers that I've seen making offers to these veterinarians, these offers are significantly lower than what I'm securing for them with employers that don't require non-competes. Significantly lower. This one, for example, is $115,000. I mean, you can make $115,000 as a manager of a fast food restaurant. So that's an incredible point that I don't think I've ever heard anybody else make. And I'm glad you said that. I think you're exactly right.
Yeah. Well, I think it have to be proven, but thank you. I appreciate the compliment.
It can easily be proven. There's a lot of veterinary economists out there that can do it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is simple labor economics, right? If you have an artificial, and I think that, like we said earlier in the episode, it's one of the principal reasons the FTC is considering abolishing them, is because it deprives workers of higher wages, because you do not have that flexibility to negotiate. Why am I going to pay you more? You can't leave. So yeah, what that would do to cost of veterinary care, I don't know, but I guess on the flip side of that, Paul, that's where, if we're looking at this from an investment perspective, how much of that depressed salary is contributing to lower vet bills for pet parents versus how much of it is contributing towards greater profits for the organizations that are enforcing these non-competes and depressing veterinary wages.
Well, I can confidently say that the last thing to be impacted by any of these changes will be their margins. They'll raise prices and normalize compensation before they ever touch their margins.
But I know we're about at time, and this has been a great discussion. I hope everyone found it useful, and to me it's gratifying to be able to bring some light to a very important issue in the animal health space, in the veterinary medicine space, and to be able to get some leading minds to comment on it. Henry, thank you so much for providing your legal expertise. Paul, thank you for your passionate advocacy for the veterinary profession and for the ending the non-compete to provide better quality of life and work for veterinarians. These are important discussions to have, and I'm glad we're having them. And thank you both so much for participating.
Hey, Henry, Peter, this was an incredible conversation. I'm glad we had it. I'm so glad that you guys invited me to participate in this. And you know what? I hope we could do it again later in the future.
No, it was really a pleasure. Thank you both. I really enjoyed it. Always a pleasure to lend kind of a generalist legal knowledge to an issue where it's really at the intersection of a number of different issues and brings up really interesting philosophical questions as well.
Well, on behalf of Henry and Paul, this is Peter Kenseth with Petworking. I will say, for the veterinarians out there, if you need legal advice, Henry is at Canin LLP. Henry Whitehead, Canin LLP, look him up. And if you need other input on reviewing your contracts or discussing the non-compete recruiting services, reach out to Paul. Offer First, Paul Diaz. Both, I think are valuable resources for veterinarians out there who may be contemplating, employment options, employment contracts, thank you both for contributing to this valuable discussion today around the veterinary non-compete.
Absolutely.
For Petworking, this is Peter Kenseth. We'll see everybody again soon. Petworking is presented by Maya Strategy Group, a leading market research and strategy consulting firm, helping clients in the pet care and animal health industries navigate strategic challenges for almost 2 decades.